Welcome to another Confluence Podcast. I'm Randall Stevens, and as usual, I've got Evan Troxel with me, and today's guest is Christy Chapman. It's going to be a fun episode, a little bit different than previous ones we've done in that Christy isn't in the AEC industry, but she was, I was telling Evan before the call at this year's Confluence, she spoke. I'll give the background about why she was invited and a little bit about what she talked about, but she was the favorite speaker. Like I was just telling her, it's like we survey everybody afterwards, and it's always like a lot of fun. So first of all, thanks, Christy, for coming on. And this is going to be fun to talk about. So I'll kind of cue it up, and then we can just kind of riff on this, and you can jump in. But so the connection is that I'm here in Lexington, Kentucky. I've been involved. I'm a graduate of the University of Kentucky. I went to architecture school there. And I've known for now 25 years, a guy named Brent Seales, who's, you can look him up. He's kind of famous now. And you'll learn through this conversation why, but when I first met him, in the late 90s, he was at the university and was really the computer vision expert. One of those guys there I was into the graphics side. And so I got introduced to Brent and got to know him at the university. So he's been a research professor at the University of Kentucky since sometime, I assume in the 90s, that he came and became a tenured professor there in the computer science department. But he was running what was called the Center for Visualization and Virtual Environments, and I was just involved over there because of all the things, graphics and all the kind of cool stuff they were doing. Fast forward, if you've seen, I keep saying it's like the sexiest project that you could imagine being involved with. So Brent had this bright idea, and we're going to try to get Brent on some point too. We'll get Brent on here to talk about this. But at some point 20 odd years ago, Brent had this idea that you should be able to use a CT scanner or scan these Vesuvian scrolls. So if you know when Mount Vesuvius erupted and it covered Pompeii in ash, now what they found is there are all these scrolls. They say they look like little piles of poop. They look like a turd, but it's like these scrolls were covered in ash, and there are hundreds of them that they found, but they could never read them or know what was inside of them. So Brent started this project 20 years ago thinking that, hey, could you scan these like with a CT scanner and then virtually unwrap them so that you could read what was on these pages? It sounds like crazy enough that 20 years later, they're actually doing it. So it's actually, it's amazing. It's one of those, that's what Christy her talk was like, how do you go from some crazy idea through all these hurdles and hoops and ups and downs and all this kind of stuff. But, for those of you, listening to this podcast, go Google Vesuvius Challenge and go watch. They've been on 60 Minutes. They've been on all kinds of TV shows and all these interviews now that it's happened. But anyway, I'll use that to tee it up. Christy, maybe you can tell a little bit about yourself and we can just...
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I had a great time at the Confluence event and really enjoyed meeting everybody. I'm happy to hear that everyone enjoyed my talk because if you remember, I did go a little bit over, and so people were getting really hungry. So I'm glad to know that didn't affect anything. But I've been working for Brent Seales. That's, as Randall said, that's the professor's name. You can Google that too. It's probably a lot more will pop up about the history and everything if you use his name instead of Vesuvius Challenge. But I've been working for him since 2016. I kind of started working for him as just a freelance writer and editor. And then my role kind of evolved into basically a chief cat herder is what I say. I try to manage, or I do manage pretty much all of the projects on the logistics side. I do everything except code is what I tell people. And I actually do a little bit of that, but not for my job. So, I came to the project right after the Antiquity scroll that work had been done, and helped write that paper and get that paper published and out. And it made front page news way back then. That was in 2016. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. I actually work remotely most of the time. from Florida, but I am back and forth to UK because most of what I do on the team, I don't have to be on campus to do.
Yeah. So just to dig in a little bit more background about the kind of evolution of that project, or kind of what led to all this was they began scanning and kind of just proving out the theory and then writing code in the early days, literally to, if you imagine taking a piece of paper and rolled it up, and if you were to scan it, theory was that the ink would show up, or whatever, was on the paper would show up different in those scans, those cross-section scans. And then the trick would be, okay, if you've scanned through this, can you virtually put it back together? Right. And then unfold it, unwrap it. And that was the first stuff when I first knew.
Well, and that was the principle that continued. I mean, with the scroll from Ngati, which I mentioned, that was the first time anything had ever been virtually or digitally opened and read that could never be opened and read physically. And that was actually a scroll that was found near the Dead Sea in Israel. It was found in the 70s. They were excavating this not ancient, but medieval Byzantine time period synagogue that had burned, and came across where the ark would have been. They came across that spot and noticed there were these little charcoal things about the size of my finger lying there. So one of the archaeologists scooped them up and put them in a box, and they sat on a shelf until, 2014, when they started digitizing the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff. And so they went ahead and scanned that, like you said, in a micro CT scanner. And because at the time it was written, most of the ink was made with ingredients that included some type of metal, like lead in the ink or something like that. And because the way X-ray works is it basically is looking for differences in density, because the metal in the ink is so much denser than the parchment on which the information was written. It showed up in the X-ray. And so, there was a process. It didn't just appear, which everyone always kind of thinks, but like there was a set of algorithmic steps that the data had to go through in order for that to happen. So that was the first time, and because it was because it had some type of metal in the ink, it was easier than the Herculaneum scrolls. The Herculaneum scrolls had a couple of more challenging issues than the scroll from Ngati.
Yeah, some of the imagery that you'll see if you go and Google around this project was, fast forward, AI has now come into play, and we could maybe dive in a little bit, Christy, to the story about how this all came together during kind of COVID time.
Sure.
Anyway, there was a challenge put together, and now they're using AI because it's not even human. A human can't even see the letters on pieces of parchment that,
right.
That you can read. It's indiscernible to a human eye. And it's so minute little changes that only, now all of a sudden using some training with AI, all of a sudden is being able to pick up all this. Anyway, it's like I said, it's a very sexy project.
Well, it's at least, we hear a lot of horror stories about AI and how it's going to take over all our jobs. So it's at least a positive kind of hopeful use of AI. It's actually giving something to society instead of really, taking something away or replacing something. The way the Vesuvius Challenge came about is, like I said, because the ink of the Ngati scroll had metal in it, it was, our process worked very well on it. But the problem with the ink that was used in ancient Rome at the time these were penned is that it was made out of carbon. They would burn wood literally and mix the soot with something and something else, and that would be their ink. So when you take something that is take an ink made out of carbon, and then you write on papyrus, which is a carbon object, has carbon in it, and then you carbonize it all. You have carbon on carbon in carbon. So it becomes impossible. Yeah, you're exactly right. It becomes impossible to see the ink in the X-ray. It's completely invisible. Like it just looked like a blank X-ray of papyrus. And so I guess about in 2017, they started working on a convolutional neural network, which is just a type of, machine learning tool to train up a network that could look at the CT data, metaphorically speaking, of course, look at the CT data, learn that this voxel, which is a 3D pixel, basically, very, very tiny, this tiny 3D spot has ink and this tiny 3D spot doesn't. And we train the network to recognize the difference in the data, something that we can't see, but the computer, because at the end of the day, data is all just a bunch of zeros and ones, right? Arranged in different ways or whatever. And so you can pick up the different way the data appears when there's ink versus when there isn't ink. And we had to train that network. We had to take photographs of some of the scrolls that had been opened, hundreds of years ago. Because they did try. I mean, when they found them at first, they burned them because they, like I said, they look like, or you said, that they look like just charred logs or waste. And so they burned them for fuel. But then eventually someone dropped one and they realized there was Greek in it. So they started excavating and really tried to open them and read them. And they sort of successfully were able to open some. And there have been some editions created of the opened papyrus telling us what they say. But that was still very challenging and incomplete. It's a very fragmented collection. But that destruction, actually, which if you Google and you see pictures, you'll see it's just a huge mess. That destruction actually is what provided the ground truth or the training data that we needed, because we took pictures of those and we also put some fragments in a micro CT scanner. Same one. You had a photo of it, and then we had X-ray data of it, and aligned those in a way so that every spot where there was ink in the photo, we could tell the micro CT data, this spot has ink. And so you go through that whole process, lots and lots and lots of times, and it learns what the data signature, if you will, is when there's ink versus when there's not ink. And then you just apply that to new CT data on a fragment or a scroll that is never seen. And the idea is that it will be able to do the same thing in that scroll. It will be able to take what it's learned from the other thing, the fragment, and apply it to the thing it's never seen before and make those same determinations. Yeah, here's ink, there's not ink, etc. And that's what makes the ink appear. And we always have to explain to people that this is not letter recognition. We're not training a network to recognize using English, an A or a B or a C. We're training a network to recognize that this tiny little 3D square basically has ink. So if you can imagine, just pinpointing each of those spots where the computer realizes there's ink, eventually you see a letter shape, and eventually you see spaces, and eventually you see words, and eventually you see lines. So that's how it works.
Also means any language, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it would work on drawings even. Anything that you can train in terms of how the ink would look, So the way the Vesuvius Challenge came about is we had done that work and we published a paper in 2019 where we had done that work on prototypes, and we had a very, very tiny Herculaneum fragment, like just one character, like lunate sigma. And we had proven that the concept worked, but if you know anything about AI, it requires a lot of training data, and we didn't have very much. And, it also requires just a lot of coding and a lot of work. And we had basically one graduate student working on the problem. So progress was slow. Then 2020 happened. And of course, we all know that our lives all kind of came to a screeching halt. Because even if we could continue working in the lab on the computer, it was still a very distracting, upsetting time. So progress slowed down, and because people didn't have anything to do, as you know, a lot of people just started surfing the internet trying to fill time. And Nat Friedman was actually one of those, and he fell down the rabbit hole of information about ancient Rome, and one link led to another, and he stumbled upon a lecture that Brent gave in 2019 talking about the work and the progress we had made, and that we knew that this method would work.
Just for everybody, Nat was the CEO of GitHub.
Right.
Worked at Microsoft, had made a lot of money at Microsoft, and found this project, called it Brent.
Yeah, he read about it, listened to the talk, and then, read about it. And there's a quote from him in one of the news articles that came out later after the challenge grand prize was awarded. And it was like something like, how the hell did I not know about this? I mean, and he called it the coolest tech project ever. So yeah, he reached out to Brent. Brent didn't really recognize him, or he just sent emails, and eventually Brent did respond. And to make a long story short, they met. They talked about what the challenges were, where we were, and why it was so slow. Academic research is very slow. It involves, you got to write a grant and get funding, and then you have to you have to have the students, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they came up with this idea, and Nat suggested, well, hey, why don't we do a contest? I'll raise the money, from all my
rich friends,
Silicon Valley entrepreneur type people who like to invest in new ventures. And you can release all your data. You can release all the software code that you've already written. You can write tutorials so that people can understand how to use the things that you've already written, and it'll be great. We'll, have a contest, and somebody will be a win, and we'll win, and we'll be reading Herculaneum. So that's how that came about, and Brent agreed, even though it was, you can imagine that we actually had team meetings about it to decide, do we really want to do this? What were the risks, and what was the upside, and was it worth it? And academia is a place where people hold on very, very tightly to their ideas.
I don't think it's just there though, Christy. I think that's one of the
really?
lessons in this, right? That people tend to, they want to hold on to everything. Everything's like some intellectual property, and sometimes you have to let it go. I mean, we talk on this podcast, because we have a lot of people developing software and using technology, about, build or buy. Do I want to, do I want to build this and kind of own it, and it's some proprietary thing, or should I be, looking for something that's commercially available out there, and, is it really special what I'm doing or not? But I think there are lessons to be learned in this story.
Yeah. Well, it was very difficult to decide that, because Stephen was really the grad student, Stephen Parsons. He was in the middle of his PhD work, and he's basically giving it up,
For the world.
Yeah. And it took some work for the little team that we had. There was me, who's not a coder. There was Dr. Seales, who really doesn't, or Brent, who doesn't code anymore. And then we had two guys, who were working on trying to help get the people up to speed about how to use the tools, Anyway, so Nat raised the money, and we started with a $200,000 prize pool. And then within just a couple of days, the word spread, and other people contacted him and wanted to contribute. And we wound up with a $1 million prize pool. And then there was some press about the contest launching, and Nat was on a couple of podcasts that are heavily listened to by coders, programmers. And so, yeah, before long, we had a lot of people on the Discord server, which is the chat platform that they used to communicate with each other. And off we went. So it was exciting. And also nerve-wracking a little bit, but in the end, it really was a genius move on Brent's part, because, we achieved so much more than we would have been able to achieve just with one person.
So, Christy, the prize was broken up into first one to decipher X amount of text, or the first words even, or a sentence.
Yeah.
It was a word, right? The first word.
Yeah. So the first thing they did is they had a Kaggle contest, which was basically just improving the ink ID. So they did a little contest then just on Kaggle, but the major one was, the first letters prize. which you had to find so many letters within a certain size space with only so many missing, right? And it ended, so they intentionally made it a first letters prize because you might find letters within that space with some missing letters, and therefore you're not going to be able to have a word. But it turned out, Luke Ferreter, the person who won, he found a word, purple.
What, an undergrad?
Yes, he was an undergrad at the University of Nebraska. And he had been working as a SpaceX intern. And he heard about the contest basically through Nat talking on the podcast about it. And he was like, oh, I got to do this. It's kind of funny. They use this term called nerd sniped. And I guess, there are so many people who are so passionate about this project that it's really been interesting to see the technological community, the computer programmers get so excited and be so invested. Luke took his money that he won, $40,000, and he bought more computers. So he had more computing power because you have to have a lot of computing power the challenge had set some up, that people could use, but he bought more computers, reinvested, in other words.
Wow.
So
this was in 2020, you said?
Yeah, so that it was in 2020 when Nat sort of fell down the rabbit hole of the ancient Rome, and found out about Brent's work. And then what happened was he just kept following, waiting for us to reveal more text, and there was no word. 2020 turned into 2021. 2021 turned into 2022, and that's when he contacted Brent. Was in 2022, like in the summer of that year. They met, and then we had a meeting in January, and then the contest launched in March of 2023.
It went fast too, Evan. If you go look at the story, the first word, and then within just a handful of months, they had done hundreds of words. Like it went really fast once they started.
Once it worked, yeah.
I have a few questions here. I'm just curious because it started going fast. So were teams allowed to build on other teams' work? Is this kind of like the whole idea was that it was all open? Everything everybody did was open?
Yes, it was an open source, completely open source contest. And, the organizers, the team was really brilliant in that they realized, even though it's supposed to be open source, right, people are not necessarily going to share what they're doing, what they're working on. And we all knew it was going to take a village, literally. I mean, it was going to take everybody working and everybody sharing, because there was just so many parts to the puzzle. And so they set up what were called progress prizes. The first letters prize was one of those. It was a big one, but they also set up other prizes: $5,000, $2,000, $10,000. They would have a call for a particular tool or a particular problem to be solved or whatever, and people would do that work and submit it, and they would be rewarded for it. And one of the stipulations was that if you submitted for the progress prize, you had to release that data and release that code so it could be used by the rest of the community. So yeah, by the time the contest ended, or maybe even by the end of the year, that was the deadline. December 31st, 2023 was the deadline. They had awarded something like 50 progress prizes.
Wow, cool.
I think except for the $40,000 first letters prize, they varied from like $1,000 to $10,000.
And that the big prize that got awarded, the young man that won the original prize teamed up with two others, right, in Europe, and they ended up together winning the big grand prize.
Yeah, one of the things that the other thing the progress prizes did was alert team members to each other and what their strengths were and what they were working on, et cetera. And so, Luke and Youssef. Luke Ferreter was from the University of Nebraska. Youssef is from Egypt originally, but he was a graduate student at a university in Germany. Youssef came in right behind Luke and was a second prize winner in that first letters prize. And actually, when you talk about it moving fast, we had those first letters and from Luke. And then within a week, we had, 5 partial columns from Youssef. So it just really went. And then by the end of the year, so that was in October when that was awarded. By the end of the year, December 31st, we ended up with those 15 and a half columns, which was the most, text ever revealed from inside something like that. They couldn't be opened.
They think, Evan, that these scrolls were in the private library of the father-in-law of Julius Caesar, right?
Wow.
Yeah, that's right.
Jeez.
And there's hundreds of them. There's like hundreds of them still there, right? That
Yeah.
they haven't done anything.
Charcoal fingers, but so
But these are actually bigger.
Yeah,
The Getty Scroll was small, but these are more like, this.
So maybe talk about the physical, like what's actually happening with the micro CT machine. So like, it's bombarding this thing from all sides and capturing what? Like, I'm just curious, like what this process looks like in physical world.
Sure. So it's a CAT scan, basically, super high powered CAT scan. Same thing you would have done, of your brain or whatever. But this is much, much higher energy and more radiation. Much higher than white.
Yeah, they've had to didn't they go to London or some different place?
Yeah.
Find the right equipment. It's not just your
right. Like,
normal.
yeah.
You can't just get it off eBay.
Yeah. We've used desktop machines, but they weren't capturing fine enough resolution. In other words, like I was saying, the ink is in these little tiny voxels, right? You're telling it voxel by voxel. Yes, there's ink. Yes, there's ink. And if you say your voxels are, this big and your scan is getting this, you're going to miss it. It's got to be really fine. So the benchtop sources weren't advanced enough. So yeah, what we did is we took the scrolls to a particle accelerator, a synchrotron, high energy physics facility that does all kinds of experiments and stuff. But one of them is they can do micro CT. And that was no small feat. That's a whole other story. But getting the institutions that own these precious objects to allow us to pack them up, fly them to, or take the train in that case. They went from Paris, actually. The first one that they virtually unrolled was from Paris, the collection in Paris. They took the train to, Oxford. It's near Oxford in England. That was a major accomplishment and a major ordeal in and of itself.
So there's these scrolls, even though they originated in Pompeii, some of them have ended up in museums around the world.
Yeah, they were found in a sister city of Pompeii called Herculaneum. So the volcano is here and like Pompeii's over here and Herculaneum's back there.
Did I tell you that I was there a few years ago? Yeah. I actually was near the Vesuvius and got to
the volcano,
tour that. But this past summer, we were vacationed in Sicily, and there's another active volcano there. Literally, it was like in our backyard, like spewing. I was like, holy crap, this is harking back to I'm going to bed. I may not be here in the morning if this explodes. It's like,
it's no joke. Yeah, and even there's some near Naples, on the other side of Naples, that are active, too. So basically, we had to devise a way of placing these objects in the scanner, in the beam is what we call it. Basically, there's a beam that comes out, an X-ray beam. What happens is a particle accelerator, you have electrons in a circle. You can Google diamond light source and you'll see this beautiful picture of the facility, and it's just a big, huge metal circle. And the electrons go around faster and faster and faster and faster. And when they're diverted from that course, they emit an X-ray. So around that circle, every so many meters, there's an X-ray chamber, basically. And the beam is diverted. They use magnets, actually, to move the electrons. But the beam is diverted into these into these lab spaces, imaging spaces, and it X-rays, sends a very, very strong, highly radioactive beam into that space and creates the X-ray. You have the beam coming in, and then you have a detector, basically, that captures the picture on the other side. how it works. It's just a 3D X-ray is really what it is. And yeah, you have it. We had to put it in there vertically in order to get the best imaging. And so we created special cases, that were form fitted. And the way it works is the object sits in the beam that's coming out and it rotates ever so minutely and captures X-rays at every one of those points.
Wow.
And then at the end, there's software that takes all of that and puts it together, reconstructs it into a 3D model of the object. And because it's an X-ray, you can see everything inside it too. You don't just see the 3D shape of it, but you get these, every time it turns, you get these slices, and you can see the structure. And it's those slices that we use to do the virtual unwrapping, actually.
We'll put some links in the show notes.
Yeah,
to
for
the
sure.
videos that show all of this. It's, it's just amazing when you go look at it.
It sounds absolutely incredible, like straight out of a movie. And I'm pretty sure they do this every week on like some CSI show on CBS, right? But it is like science fiction come to reality here.
Can't make
absolutely.
it up. I think, Christy, the talk you gave was, a lot about just how audacious this, just even for Brent to like have this thought and then to dedicate that much time and energy, right? With all the ups and downs and everything, it's like, it should never happen. And then when it finally does, everybody just assumes it like, oh, they did this overnight. It's like, no.
You invented.
This is built on
Yeah.
lots and lots of work, and to Brent's credit, right, really became his life, passion for. But it's I say it's sexy because it's like it's technology, it's antiquity, it's the who knows what's written on all these things, right? That will get unlocked and what people were thinking and writing about it in the time, and
it's really important in terms of that because we have so little material actually from the ancient world. A lot of what we have that was written by people actually living in antiquity was copied at some point by the medievalists. And so you get it through you get it almost secondhand, so to speak. There was an original work that was copied, and that's kind of what we have today. So we have very little original material actually from antiquity. And, people have said who are experts in ancient history and things like that because there is so much, you're right, there are hundreds of these scrolls. And if we can virtually unwrap them and open them all, that it could change a lot about what we think about the ancient world or, at minimum, explain a lot more. Most of what they've found so far is just philosophical texts, Epicurean philosophy in particular, but not everything. And, I don't know what the percentage of the overall collection that's actually been opened that they've been able to read, but it's pretty small compared to, if you count all of the scrolls that they found. So, yeah, it is an important collection, because of that.
So that's the big challenge now, right? That now that they kind of have started getting the technology there's different people want to claim ownership of and hard to get your hands on the scrolls now. It's like everybody starts, kind of withdrawing into their corners, and it's like, okay.
Yeah, it's interesting because they've always been valued, and the libraries and institutions. What happened was when they were found, the king of Naples at the time sort of gave them out to fellow dignitaries. Pretty much, I think it's peace offerings, right? He gave a set of 3 or 5 maybe to Napoleon. And that's why France has some, because, Napoleon was running around taking over everybody. So
a parting gift here.
Yeah. So France wound up with some. And then he gave several to the Prince of Wales at the time. And those are now in the British Library in London and at the University of Oxford Bodleian Library, Oxford. The ones in Paris are at the Institut de France. So that's how that happened, that they got so dispersed. And yeah, now they've always been well taken care of, but nobody ever really thought they would amount to anything other than a relic from the past, right? So now, it's even the people who own them have gotten a lot more interested in what we're doing and stuff. People, a couple of originally Brent went, I think I mentioned in my talk, he originally went to the University of Oxford and asked them because he knew they had some scrolls and asked them if he could scan them. And they're like, no thanks. Because again, it was a pretty audacious idea. This was in 2005. And I mean, we didn't have an iPhone in 2005.
Right.
I think the
That's
iPhone
incredible.
was like 2008 or something.
Yeah.
So when you think about if we can manage to get ourselves back there, it's so hard to even think of life without an iPhone and all of the things that have happened technologically along with it since then. It was audacious, absolutely, an audacious idea. But now they have actually they've allowed the team to scan one of their scrolls at the Diamond Light Source Synchrotron in Oxford, and that data was just released right before Thanksgiving, I believe, to the Vesuvius Challenge, and already they have had results where ink it is appearing in that particular scan. And this one actually apparently was penned with some kind of ink that had some type of metal in it or something that creating a density shift. There's something in the ink that makes it have a density that is enough different from the papyrus that it's on that the ink shows up with the traditional virtual unwrapping method without even yet applying the AI tool. So, we are, and the good thing about that is you don't have to train on fragment from another scroll. When you train on what you know is ink from the scroll itself, then you're really training apples to apples, right? You're training it to read itself instead of training something else that's in the same, collection, but it could be very different. And we have actually found that the scrolls they respond very differently to the AI. Just because the network works on one, in other words, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work on another.
Right.
But because if you think about it, this is ancient Rome. The ink recipe is not standardized. The scribe is just mixing up his ink, and it may be one way one time, the same scribe.
Special
and
formulas, right?
Yeah. And the same thing with the papyrus. The papyrus is not always the same.
Didn't come out of a factory.
Yes, exactly. So, we kind of, I think, naively in our modern day think, oh, these are all in the same library. They're all carbonized. They all look the same, right? They're just wads of black.
But they're not.
So therefore, it's all just it's gonna be transferable. And the truth is, even if you just think of going to a library today, the differences in, paper books, they're very different. Different fonts, different sizes, different papers, So we've definitely discovered since the grand prize and since we've gotten some more data, because we've been able to scan some more intact scrolls, that they're very different and respond very differently.
Yeah, I guess it's in the when I said the success has made some people kind of retreat, but it also probably has the opposite effect too, which is now that we've seen success, now you have permission to be we want some of that too. And
exactly.
Scrolls.
No one wants to be left out now.
Yeah, that'd be kind of a position to take, I would think. Maybe Christy, a little bit about, what you talked about, or a lot of it was, the challenges, there's obviously a bunch of very technical things going on behind the scenes, but because it is such a human, everybody that sees this project would probably find something interesting about it. So very broad audience, and obviously it caught the attention. And like I said, it's been on a lot of every newspaper and TV show and website. When you go start Googling, if you hadn't seen it already, all of a sudden it'll just start showing up all over the place because it's been widely covered. But you were talking about, from your position and what you're doing with the team there, like how do you, which I think can relate to the audience that Evan and I, kind of cater this podcast to, but the idea that you've got to communicate what can be complex and technical things to a general audience, and how do you get people interested in something like this? What have you learned in this process that you could share with us?
Yeah, well, one of the main things about any type of communication is know your audience. So, a computer scientist speaking computer science-ese to a librarian at an institution that's been around for hundreds of years is not going to work. So you really have to know your audience and think about, number one, what that person cares about. So for us, it was all about most of the people, the institutions, of course, they care about the preservation and the conservation of the object. So our first thing we had to do before Brent could really even do anything was figure out a way to keep these objects safe. And I didn't include this in the talk because I had so much, but, he went and there's an artist that you probably know him, Randall. I don't know his name, even though I've been out to his place. I want to say his name was Tim something, but, Brent worked with him to create plaster models that they could build and use to transport, put it in it and stand it up in the machine. And that was back in 2009. Before you could really do 3D scanning, which is what we do now. We do something called photogrammetry, where you just take regular photographs all the way around an object, and there's software that will put it together in a 3D form. So that was first. First you have to figure out what the person's priorities are and what's important to them. And how you can allay any fears that they have. And then the second thing is, when you are trying to explain what you're going to do with this object, you have to put it in terms that relate to them. I always start out by explaining that, micro CT is a CAT scan. Just, everybody knows someone pretty much who's had a CAT scan, and that's what it is. And it's a 3D X-ray. Everyone's had an X-ray.
It's not, so it doesn't hurt you.
Yeah. So if you can get if you can get away from the terminology that is so present in your mind and think about it in a different way, like you would try to explain it to your grandmother or try to explain it to a child, not in a way that is pedantic or off-putting or you're talking down to someone, but just so you can relate what you're doing to them. That's another very, very important thing, is being humble. These objects, they're not ours. They're not even American. I think that originally, if you watch the 60 Minutes piece, which I played a clip of, Brent did kind of go in and he just thought everyone was going to, here you go. Great. I'm so glad this American scientist is over here.
Cowboy showed up.
My scrolls. And that was absolutely not what happened. And I think that, and he will tell you this because I've heard him say it, he learned to respect the history and not that he didn't originally, but you just don't necessarily think that way. When you're a scientist and you've got a goal and you want to build something or make something.
It's logical. It's all very logical. Yeah.
Yes. So, you have to be humble and have respect for the layperson or for the person who's not technically involved in your field.
I would categorize the explaining as like risk mitigation. That's like mitigate the risk. There's got to know what's the carrot. Like why would they even want to? I get now that I know you're not going to destroy these things, why would I still want to do it?
Yeah, that's the next step, is to figure out what's in it for them. How can you communicate what's in it for them in a way that makes them want to take the risk? Because it is a big risk. And, my team, one of the reasons Brent hired me was actually to represent the non-technical person. I mean, I understand it all because I kind of have that kind of brain, but I also come from a humanities background and I'm a writer. So I'm a translator is what I tell people. But, you have to understand what it looks like from them. And my team would get frustrated. Look, it's not invasive. We built these cases. You don't have to worry. And I'm like, you know what, guys, that's great. But their one job, they have one job, and it is to keep these objects. Yes, it is to keep these objects safe. So if they weren't difficult for you guys to work with, they would not be doing their job. So you have to let them do their job, answer their questions. I mean, I'll never forget, we were doing a project in New York at the Morgan Library Museum, and it was actually a book, a codex from like 5th or 6th century. It's written in an Egyptian Coptic language, which is a transitional language from hieroglyphics into Greek, actually. And it had been burned. So you couldn't really open it, but there were some loose leaves, and they knew it contained the Acts of the Apostles, at least on 2 pages. So we wanted to use our technology, scan it, virtually open it, and et cetera. And the last day of the project, the very last day, I came in that morning, and the paper conservator there, the person who was in charge of this, she had a stack of papers that she had been reading about the damage that synchrotron imaging, which I've explained to you about what a synchrotron is and how very different from a desktop machine, which we were using at the time. Synchrotron imaging, it causes molecular changes to papyrus and all this kind of stuff. And she was not going to put that book in the scanner. We had already scanned it maybe once, but today was the day we were going to have the longest scan and the best scan and the one that was probably going to give us the data we needed. And she was not going to put it in there. I mean, she was not. And I tried to explain to her, that those studies were done, at a much, much higher energy facility with much, much stronger radiation. And, it's the same as, if you take a magnifying glass, the light coming into the magnifying glass is at one level, but when it goes through the magnifying glass and comes out at the other end, it'll burn paper. We're just using the light before it gets to the magnifying glass. This is not after it comes out of the magnifying glass, which is kind of the, analogy with the synchrotron, the particle accelerator. Nope, she wasn't doing it. So Brent had already left, and his family had come with him, and they had already left, and we're in the car driving, and I called him, and I'm like, Maria is not going to put this in the machine. You have got to talk to her. When he gets on the phone, she gets off and she says, he said the exact same thing you did. He told me blah, 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 blah. I used the analogy of the magnifying glass. And so then she was okay. So, it wasn't, and that doesn't, you have to respect that, right? It's her job to keep these safe. She has scientific documentation that we're changing the molecular structure of this object. And it wasn't enough for me, a non-computer scientist. I had only been working for Brent at that point, like a year maybe. She needed to hear from the guy, right? And you just have to, sometimes you have to do that. You have to talk people off the ledge, and you have to understand, and you have to, give them the access and the comfort they need. I mean, we went ahead and did it, and it was fine. And we actually were able to, you can see some of it on our website. It's called the M910 project. And you can see some of the images where we were able to see what the pages actually said, But that's a perfect example of, being able to communicate to somebody in a way that is respectful and also explains things so that it puts their fears at ease. I don't know what kind of communication issues, your listeners might have, but I have found, even just among my colleagues, being nice, saying thank you, saying please,
Totally.
It may not matter right now in this conversation, but it builds an impression of you that is a part of who's asking the thing the next time that they're uncomfortable doing, right? And not talking down to people. I mean, in an academic environment, it's kind of funny because, I'm not an academic, but I will talk to some of my colleagues who are academics, and just me one-on-one, it's one kind of conversation. But you get the two of them talking together to each other, and I'm like, what on earth did you
different language
into? Yeah. And they just, it's just weird. So just don't talk down to people either. If you're in a position where you know a lot about something and they don't, they're automatically intimidated. You don't have to intimidate them. They're already intimidated. So the best thing you can do is just, not talk down to people and explain to them what they need to know. The other thing that's always good is to have them ask questions, because then you can figure out what it is they actually need to hear, or, I always listen way more than I talk when I'm in a new situation.
2 ears, one mouth, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the other things that I thought of when you were talking about she talks to you and then she talks to Brent, and she got kind of the same story, but maybe hearing it a second time, it landed a little bit better. But also, like his reputation's on the line, and hearing it from him.
Yes.
Like one thing that bothers me a lot about like corporate communication is when the boss, whoever that is, he or she would give somebody else the job of delivering bad news or delivering making a promise or whatever it is.
Right.
And it means so much more coming from someone who really has skin in the game and accountability, and that I think can make a big difference. And so part of the strategy of communication is also who delivers it, how they deliver it, what language they're speaking. It's all of these things, and it's complicated, right? But it's all part of the equation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's, like I said, he was the man. She had to talk to him. And I think that was right, for her to want that and for him to take the time to do it. Because that's her job. She has one job.
Yeah. Right.
Well, I think a lot of the people that Evan and I do end up communicating with through this podcast are in usually technical roles, and then they're having to communicate and to people that you may think are technical, but a lot of times you're in these firms, a lot of times aren't that technical. And my guess is maybe, Evan, you've got more insights into this because you were even in your own practices that you were involved with, but probably the people that are most successful in those kinds of roles are the ones that can communicate in the ways that understand.
Absolutely.
Like,
100%.
have to be empathetic, have to understand. I like to think I do teach. I always feel like I'm a teacher at heart, so I love to explain things. Something that I think I know something about, I'll talk all day long about it. I just love explaining things that I think I know something about to somebody else. So maybe that's part of it too, right? Is like, okay, you got to understand that you like to explain things to people. The not talking down. I think that's a biggie, right? Is to be like, hey, you're not a show off just because
Yeah, and I think
they know a lot more than about a million other things that I don't understand. It works both directions, right?
Right. Everybody has their area of expertise. It's just not the same as yours always, right? And I think a lot of times people don't realize that they're talking down to someone or that it's perceived as them talking down. When you've explained this technical process or this tool a million times, you get frustrated when, and so it's just, you really have to constantly be checking yourself and realize that it is important enough to do that. I think communication is extremely underrated in terms of how important it is to keep things functioning. We all have communication programs and departments and stuff like that, but, just your daily conversations, it's really, really important for you to think about what you're saying and how you're saying it. A lot of times people in these situations when they feel like they should know, maybe. They feel like you're going to expect them to know. And so they might pretend to know and you just kind of have to ignore that and recognize on your own where they're from or whatever. And ask, like I said, just ask questions.
Yeah, they won't always tell you when they
feel out
something too, right? People won't always tell you when they don't understand something.
No, they will absolutely not.
They don't want to.
It's funny because we'll be in meetings and somebody will, like even our students, we have our students working on different projects with different equipment here in the lab, and it's all virtually, it's all digital restoration kinds of stuff for the most part, humanities oriented scientific work or computer technology work on humanities projects. But they'll sometimes mention something because they're doing something over here that, Brent's not really involved in, or that's not his specialty. And he still will ask questions.
Sure.
So you have to make it so that, and that's just because he's confident enough that, he knows what he doesn't know, and he's okay with that. But when you're in a position of power, so to speak, which a tech person is often in these or they feel like it, right? In these companies, the person may not feel safe asking questions or displaying their ignorance and you just really have to, a lot of it is putting people at ease, trying to put people at ease. We work a lot with our students actually on their communication skills. That's another thing I do here is work with our undergrads. They have to do presentations about their work. And it's because engineers are not always the best communicators. We're all made differently, and the way our brains work gravitate one way or another. And so sometimes they're just not the best communicators, but you can learn, You can absolutely learn to listen first and to ask questions and to smile. And, some of the things that are just simple and basic, not talk down to people, not use jargon. We really try to hammer that home because it's really important. Most people who are computer scientists are not going to be just talking to computer scientists.
Right.
They're not going to be just talking to tech people because what their work is doing is, is for non-tech people, right? We're all using the things that the tech people create. So it's a really important skill that we really try to work with our students on.
You're mentioning all the things that my wife and I have been working on our youngest child with, and he's 18. And it's like, you can't just totally overwhelm the person with the things that you're interested in, right? And so it's the saying is like, it's like better for someone to think that you don't know what you're talking about than to open your mouth and prove it, right? So there is a way around that, right? And it is to listen, and it is to ask questions and just be curious, because if you can learn something, you're in a way better position than you are just sitting there nodding along saying nothing versus overpowering the situation with what you're interested in that they may be completely disinterested in. So right. I love the things that you're talking about, because communication is an underrated skill, and it really does move things along in very profound ways. And it's really interesting to hear you talking about that even in the grad school levels and the academic side of it.
I'm pretty sure 20 years ago that I probably would not have admitted that I didn't know something in a conversation, but I can tell you it's one of the weapons that I've learned.
It's a superpower.
Oh man, it's like if somebody says something, it happens all the time. I'm in conversations with our customer base, and it's like if they say something, I'll just be like, no idea what that means.
Yeah.
And tell me about that. All of a sudden it's disarming, right? It's like, okay.
Exactly.
And then when I do act like I know something, I think that's what I've learned is like, there are things that I think I know a lot about. It's why people come, right, and seek out, stuff that we're doing, but you can easily kind of disarm that conversation as soon as you let hey, I don't know everything. When I think I know something, I was telling Evan before this call about another friend of mine, Lamar, that I have come and talk to my class. And one of the favorite things that I love that he says is, if it came out of my mouth, I believed it. Didn't mean it was right, but I believe it, right? It's like, that's such a great, it's like, you can trust me. And I think that, today there's a lot of distrust when people are spewing things and, and when you get caught not knowing it, it's like, man, I'll never trust you again. But I do think that there's a huge lesson in, hey, if somebody says something, people are using acronyms and jargon all the time. I'll be like, I've never heard that. Never.
Well, and like I said, it just rolls off their tongue. They don't even realize they're doing it.
I call it talking shop. We talk shop all the time, especially when you're around colleagues. And it's like when you go out to a different audience, they're not going to know what you were talking.
Right. Yeah.
And you may not know it because they may not admit that they didn't even understand half the words that were coming out of your mouths.
Right.
A lot of lessons to be learned there in just internal communication. But one of the things that we talk about, in our business with software going into these firms, buying software is the easy part. We talk about how the real challenge is, how does the person who's going to buy this get 300 people inside their firm to do something that they want them to do with this? That's the really hard thing to get done. It's like, but I think that's where the lessons in this are. It's like, what do you communicate? What's the outcome? Why should they want to do this? because you're talking about changing behaviors, and
Yes.
when you change somebody's behavior, good luck, right?
Well, and, with software, so much of it comes down to efficiency. You will become more efficient using the new thing, but there's a long time before that, and you're more efficient on the old thing, right? So that's always tricky.
Painful.
It is very painful. Absolutely.
It's got to be way up somebody's priority list, right? To want to take on that pain. But anyway.
Well, and figuring out, how to help people through that. I think that you can't just throw software. I mean, a lot of times you get software thrown at you and here you go. And even the training is not good, and I think there is, again, it's a communication problem. It's a pure communication problem. How do you explain to someone what this is, how to use it, how it's going to benefit them, and then help them make that transition, coming up with ways that alleviate the pain. I guess you can't avoid some of it, but I do feel like there are probably ways that can be mitigated too. If I figure that out, maybe I'll make a lot of money, right?
Well,
Consultant.
we can kind of wind this down, but I do want to try to get Brent on.
Yeah.
But I was just going to say, I've known, obviously, as I said, I've known Brent for a long time, but he is one of those special guys that can bridge between,
Oh yeah,
super, super smart technology, but approachable, and you can talk to him and have a normal conversation. He's not.
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely.
So I'm sure that helped in the evolution of this project.
Oh yes.
Well, but
yes, absolutely. And he, like I said, he adapted too. He figured out his audience. Realized who his audience were, what their needs were, what their concerns were. Yeah.
One thing that I was going to say that really is impressionable about this whole thing was this prize, the way that prize thing happened. And Brent had this idea almost 20 years ago, maybe 20 plus years ago, right? You're coming up on 20 years at least. And a lot has changed in 20 years. It went from an idea to reality, right? And I would be maybe curious, maybe we save this question for Brent, but like what is there another audacious goal in the works or?
Oh yeah.
But there's this, going back to the original thing, it's like where a lot of people keep these ideas close to the vest, right? And they don't want people to know, they don't want to share. But the way you ran the prize, because of because of the way Nat came in and had this idea about how to run this prize and to open source it all. I'm sure there were a lot of cool lessons learned there. But just the idea of like Brent sharing this idea, somebody else kind of following along in the shadows, right? Like not really just waiting for more information. The information never came out, and then they approached Brent to open this up to scale, right? I mean, and that's what a lot of venture people are pretty good at, right? It's like figuring out ways to get it out in front of more people. But just the idea behind all that of sharing ideas, and somebody else comes alongside that and turns a good idea into a great idea, or something that was impossible into something that's possible. And I just want to encourage the audience, right? There's a lot of people working on their little pet projects. It's really cool to talk about those projects, because you will find the other weirdos out there who are as interested in that thing as you are, or slightly adjacent, who are willing to team up and do these things together. I just think there's a really important lesson there, and we're seeing it here at the highest levels in academia, with venture and GitHub and technology and the Antiquities, and there's just so much going on there. But if no one ever talked about this stuff, nothing would have ever happened. Right. And so I just wanted to kind of go back to that part of it and just get your take on that, how that all unfolded.
Yeah. So, the Forbes magazine, I don't know if you guys saw it. I think I mentioned it at Confluence, and I'll try to send you the link, because it's an excellent assessment of the Vesuvius Challenge. And it's talking about that specifically. I mean, he talks about Brent's leadership generosity and being willing to bring so many people in at the moment where he was on the verge. Actually, we had the proof of concept, Anyway, it's absolutely about that. And we've been burned. I mean, Brent had some collaborations go sour, and he had colleagues, partners who were working with him on this project who ran off, took the data, and published papers without him. So, there are no guarantees, but, what, Brent gained and what the team gained, what everybody gained by not holding so tight onto the idea and the data and being willing to share and to just open it up, like you said, open it up to the world at large. It really is, I think, a lesson, as you say, and that particular piece of somebody from the Sloan School of Management, they write a column for Forbes, and it's really good in terms of, talking about that. It's hard to really lose by being generous. Sometimes you get burned, but at the end of the day, even on the situation where the other team members published the article without him, in the end, they wound up being sued. And if Brent had been a part of that project, if he had been a part of that paper, he would have been sued. And, there's always karma or whatever you want to call it.
That's what I was going to say, karma.
Yeah. So, and I mean, the other thing is I make the point in the talk, be audacious, but don't be a fool, right? Two different things. Being audacious is having the idea and believing in it and, pursuing it with wisdom. And you have to be wise about who you choose your partners to be.
Yeah. Discernment is the word I think of there. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you can't just jump into it willy-nilly. You really do need to apply discernment to the situation. Yes. And sometimes it's a yes and sometimes it's a no. I would say often more times if it's a maybe, it's probably a no, right? It's like hell yes or no. Right. And that happens through relationships and it happens through that discernment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, like I said, we had many meetings talking about this and about the contest, whether or not we should do it. And we went out there. Brent had us come with him at one point to meet and talk to Nat because he wanted mine and Steven's intuition and discernment to add to it all, right? Sure. He didn't want to make the decision by himself because it was a big decision. And we all agree 100% it was the right thing to do. But you don't know the future. And again, he wasn't foolish about it. He didn't just get starry-eyed and be like, oh, wow, this Nat Friedman, he's got a lot of money and he's Mr. GitHub. And oh, wow. He really stopped and took the time and thought about it and asked the other team members to think about it and help him make the decision. So, I think that you just have to be wise in those kinds of choices, but don't be afraid either.
I mean, looking back on it, it must be really satisfying, right?
It is actually.
But in the moment, it was probably nervous.
Well, we just didn't know how it was going to go.
Sure.
Is everyone going to say, yeah, those stupid Kentucky folk couldn't do it, so they had to have a Silicon Valley guy come in and save them, and that's why it's so rewarding reading that Forbes article, because the exact opposite happened.
Mm-hmm. So
in other words, there's not been one disparaging word written about the Kentucky team or the fact that we couldn't do it. The only one who did that, actually, it just happened last week, is one of the authors who wrote the paper without Brent. But that's a whole other story. Everyone recognizes the beauty in bringing people in and letting them be a part of it. And, the contestants are so happy to be a part of it. So it is very satisfying. It was risky and we didn't really know how it would go. What would the messaging end up being?
Yeah.
That's the other thing about communication is controlling your communication. We were very intentional about, getting ahead of the game and having a press event and, sending people press releases and stuff so that we could control the messaging, make sure that people understood We already had the tool. We had already thought of machine learning. We had already tested it and knew it would work.
It's not vaporware. It's not just an idea.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, and for the most part, it was all very positive. We did have a few instances that are interesting where the story kind of got turned upside down, and it was Nat's idea to do machine learning and all kinds of different stuff. But the media is one that is very difficult to control.
Yep. Yep.
So you do everything you can because it is so difficult to control, and then things just happen. And fortunately, people recognized what a big, generous, thing it was for Brent to release all the data, and to, develop tools to help people understand how to work with the data.
Yeah.
It was a big project getting it up and going. And of course, Nat had a team and they were great. But we had to do a lot on our side too. We couldn't just throw it to them and say, here you go. I mean, there are probably 2 people in the world, now 3 people in the world who know as much as Brent and Steven and Seth, our other team member, do about, what Herculaneum scrolls look like in tomography. I mean, it's not something that you can just sit down and understand. I mean, the data is difficult to get your mind around. And so we couldn't just turn it over. We had to, provide some structure and scaffolding, so to speak. Yeah, it's been a wild ride. And there's a company making a movie now. Oh,
really?
Yeah. We've had a lot, like Randall said, we've had a lot of press coverage. I mean, just a lot. And we've had, we were on Expedition Unknown with Josh Gates not long ago. He came to the lab. And what else? Just, Secrets of the Dead, PBS recently, that was on. We, National Geographic, I think, has been here. I mean, just a lot of people since the contest grand prize awarded. And even before that, Getty brought a lot of attention. But this particular group, they're making a feature film. And interestingly, this time, instead of it being all about the technology and the wow factor of what that's able to do, they're telling the story of Brent's quest, basically. It's actually almost 25 years.
Wow.
Because 1999, he started working on, the digital library. He had a grant from the NSF. And I think actually he may have gotten the grant in 97, but by 1999, he was already thinking about these objects that, you can't always flatten the book down and take a picture of it on a scanner because it's brittle and it's bumpy. And when you try to do that, it doesn't work. And if you take a photograph, just a 2D photograph, it doesn't work. So it goes all the way back to 99. So 25 years, I would say, for sure. But they're wanting to create a film about that story and kind of the Vesuvius Challenge being the culmination of that. So it's been interesting to, answer all their questions and stuff, thinking about it in those terms.
Well, we'll, like I said, we'll put some links. There'll be plenty of things for people to go read and go watch some of these.
Oh, yeah.
We'll put links to just to kind of get the visual behind what all we've been talking about. But, I did, one, thanks again for coming and talking to the group at the live Confluence event. And I think it brings a lot of things together, not only the project you're working on from that standpoint, but these ideas that you have to communicate. There's a technology piece of it, but there's people on the other side that you have to bring along with you, right? If you're going to lead and get things done. So I think that's the big lesson in why I was.
Yeah, well, I really enjoyed it so much, and I thank you for inviting me, and I'm so glad Brent was out of town and he couldn't do it. He's so jealous of me. But I have to ask, did I get like 100% rating on the reviews?
I'll go back and look, but I just know when.
If I didn't, I have to come back so I can get the 100% next time.
When the surveys come in, it's like we always ask, like, which was your favorite, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden it's like, Christy. It's like, so anyway.
Well, that's great. I'm glad. And it's not my story. It's just a great story. And that's the reason there's been so much coverage of it. And there They are making a movie out of it. And, there are big philosophical sort of lessons too. I mean, these things are trash.
Right.
They're trash. They're useless, except as a relic, that was found and we're going to store in a closet somewhere. They're just trash. And they're being redeemed. And their original purpose as a written text with information that was meant for someone to read is being restored. And, there's just, beauty from ashes, as the book of Isaiah said. There's just such a hopeful sort of thing about it, too, that I think resonates with people, whether they even consciously realize it or not. Yeah. So we all have trash in our lives, right? And to see in the flesh something being trash and being now turned into this great prize, literally.
Treasure. Yep.
It's just really, it's really exciting to be a part of it. And I am definitely an evangelist for the project because I think it's great.
Well, we're starting to plan for next year's Confluence in October, and maybe we'll coax you to come back and hang out with us.
Yeah, well, let me know because I can come up with all kinds of things to talk about. Obviously,
Brent's not even getting an invite this time. Straight to Christy.
Well, he's a very good speaker too. You probably heard him, Randall, and a lot of my speaking skills actually I picked up from him. I have my own, but I've also picked up some tips from him too. So you would definitely be pleased, but I don't want him to take my place.
Great.
Sounds like a twofer.
All right. Yeah. Well, thanks, Christy. This has been,
thank
great.
You. It's been a long time.
Appreciate your coming on and sharing the story and then these insights into, how to get better outcomes from these initiatives and
don't give up.
Bridging.
Be audacious.
Yeah, be audacious. Great.
Go forth and be audacious, everyone.
There you go. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.